Thank you guys so much for having me today. I'm really honored, and there are some really amazing practitioners on this call and quite a few people that have taught me so much about trees and shade and green infrastructure. And so I'm really excited to be here today to share my story and talk about cultivating human habitat by planting trees for people, and really share my experience over my career in trying to integrate green infrastructure into the built environment to create healthier, more resilient, and prosperous places. So for those that don't know me, I love nature. I love trees, and I love cities, and I love towns. And I have three amazing guys that are willing to travel the world with me and see all the beautiful places that this planet has to offer, and especially here in Arizona. And I'm also a Arizona native. I was born and raised in Jerome, and I was raised by this motley crew of artists and hippies and environmental activists and community builders who saw opportunity in the dilapidated and blighted buildings of Jerome, and really instilled in me a love and appreciation for place and nature, and just a general curiosity of why places are the way that they are. And over my lifetime, I feel like I've seen the transformation of the Verde Valley from a very rural landscape into a very suburban landscape. And I've watched the beautiful and diverse Sonoran Desert be transformed into a monoculture of suburban sprawl. And it really left me wondering with this question of why? Why are places the way that they are? And what are the forces that are shaping our cities? And why is Chicago the way Chicago is, and Phoenix the way it is, and Tucson the way it is, and Oro Valley the way that it is? And so kind of with that curiosity, I ended up in planning and real estate development. And I was fortunate enough to start my career out at the city of Phoenix during the Great Recession. And it really, I think it was just this very interesting period of time that allowed me to do projects that I don't think otherwise I would have been permitted to do. That I got to work in a variety of different departments and really kind of understand the city from the perspective of city government. And I got to work with some really incredible and amazing people like Anne and Richard and Donna and Harry, and really kind of understand the different aspects that make up our city. And I think developed through that a real deep appreciation for green infrastructure and trees. And I decided about 6 years ago, it was time for me to move on, and I decided to go work in the private sector. And I do a variety of different consulting, but a large part of the work that I do is actually taking projects from vision through design, permitting, and into construction. So really kind of seeing development from the private sector perspective. And so today I want to share my experiences, and I want to share some of those lessons that I've learned, as well as a framework for really thinking about how do you regulate green infrastructure and incorporate it into your city. And I think it's important to note a lot of my work is in and around walkable urbanism. So that's going to be a large focus of my conversation here today. So what better place to start than the Sonoran Desert, the place that we all inhabit? And I think the Sonoran Desert has so many important lessons to teach us about how to create abundance out of scarcity. And I could spend basically the rest of the day talking about this with you, and I would love to chat more about it, but I'm really just going to focus in on washes. Washes, I think, are really remarkable, and they're remarkable because of the amount of biodiversity in which they support. And I would say washes and riparian corridors. They go from everything from a Palo Verde all the way to a cottonwood tree, and no two washes are alike. They're really a reflection of the environment in which they are in. And I think if we think about our buildings as our mountains and our streets as our washes, we have an opportunity to create these ribbons of green that connect our cities together under beautiful arcs of shade while utilizing not a ton of water resources. I also believe that our indigenous cultures and our ancient cultures have a lot to teach us about how to build with nature and how to live and build sustainably. And we could talk about the Moors and the work that they did in the mountains of Spain to sow water and all of those pieces. But really, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Hohokam and the amazing canals that they built that enabled this incredibly diverse and complex society to be able to thrive in the Salt River Valley, as well as thrive in Tucson. And so they were really these canal builders, and it's really upon these canals that the European settlers, built what is called the City of Garden and Trees. And so I think what's really remarkable about this period of time in history is really what can be built when we truly value trees. And I think this was a culture and a community that saw trees for more than just the firewood and the building materials and food, but they really understood trees as an integral part of their infrastructure, that they really were critical to creating a comfortable living environment and a place that you could live year round and work year round. And what they really did was create this network of canals and streets that allowed you to travel from one end of the city to the other, so all the way from downtown Phoenix to downtown Mesa in a complete arc of shade. And so I think it really is quite amazing on what can be built when you truly value trees. And it also goes to show us what can be lost when we don't value trees. And so this is really, these pictures are from post World War II, when we started to transform from the City of Garden and Trees into the Valley of the Sun. And this is really the period of time when the great suburban experiment started taking place, and we needed to accommodate more people and more vehicles. And cottonwood trees drank too much water and they took up too much space. And so we had to remove them to make way for the cars. And so we abandoned the City of Garden and Trees, and now only remnants of it remain within our city. And you can actually find bits and pieces of it in and around the state capitol, and you can see in this infrastructure how much they value trees and how much space that they gave for them. You know, a minimum planting with planter area is about 8 feet, and you have ones as wide as 25 feet. And so post-World War II, we really see this great suburban experiment take hold, and we really start to redesign our cities and design our cities to accommodate cars and moving them across the landscape very quickly, and really dispersing our population across the landscape in a very low density type of format. And so it's really our current standards and our current regulations and our current way in which we build is really rooted in this period of time. And it really, these regulations determine not only how our cities are built, but also who can build our cities and who can benefit from them. And so now I'm going to pivot over into some of the framework that I want to share with you and thinking about how to regulate and incorporate green infrastructure into your city. And I'm covering a ton of topics, and so I'm not going into a ton of depth, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions or geek out with you at another point in time about some of more of these details. So because I'm a planner, I always believe that you need to start with the end in mind, and really ask that question of what kind of places do you want to build? I want to build healthy, resilient, and prosperous places. And I think the most healthy and resilient and prosperous places are ones that are compact and walkable, that are designed for people, not cars. And I think it's important to note that a lot of this type of development is technically illegal, and it's very challenging to get built in a lot of municipalities. There has been incredible progress made over the last 10 to 20 years, but a lot of this stuff, when you get into the nitty-gritty details of our zoning and into our technical standards, into even the placement of utilities, this is very challenging to build. But I think it's worth building, because I really truly believe that if we want to tackle, the climate crisis, that if we want to build prosperous communities, that we want to address the fraying of our social environment or the social fabric, that we really need to look at building more compact walkable places. And so in order to do that, I think it's important that we steer clear of one size fits all regulations. Like I talked about with washes, no two washes are the same. And the built environment, there's such this incredible array of diversity and design solutions, yet our regulations really only allow a very narrow band of solutions. It's either you meet the standard or you don't meet the standard. And it's really challenging to try to build things that kind of try to do things a little bit differently, that are really focused on placemaking, on high quality, compact, walkable development. So a great tool for doing for creating more flexibility and allowing more compact, walkable places is focusing on regulations that are focused more on form rather than use. So we have form-based codes, and then we have what is called Euclidean zoning, which is definitely more like, are you a residential use? Are you a commercial use? Are you industrial? And really, for example, a development that's occurring at 48th Street and McDowell is going to have the same standards potentially as a development happening at 19th Avenue in Tremonto. Even though the character and the place are very different, our standards do not take into account those. And so a great tool in form-based coding and in creating more form-based regulatory frameworks is what is called the Trans Act. And so this really comes out of the work of ecologists and biologists and their work to map out different types of habitat in the natural environment. And so Andres Dwani with DPZ thought this was an amazing tool, and we could use it also in thinking about our built environment. And so he created what is called the Rule to Urban Trans Act. And so this really recognizes that there's different types of habitat, and that we need to human habitat, and then we need to develop standards that allow for those differences and really kind of focus on what are those key aspects and create more flexibility into our regulatory frameworks. So it's kind of a hard concept to understand unless you actually walk through a place. And so I thought it would be helpful to share some pictures. These are from Portland, Maine, kind of the other side of the United States, but here in the Valley and even in Tucson, it's our built environment so fragmented. So it's sometimes hard to explain these concepts unless you have a really good, solid historical center, because that's where a lot of these ideas come from. So it's just easier to see it in this. And I have some great photos from my trip there. So T6 is your most urban of all of the different zones. And I think as it relates to green infrastructure, this is really where where gray infrastructure makes a lot of sense. We don't have a ton of space. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of utilities. The way in which our storefronts work and those kind of pieces, it's green infrastructure can undermine that, or it takes up viable, really important, valuable space for other types of uses. So you're going to see things like plazas. You're going to think about district stormwater in this place. So how can we take it out of here and move it into another area and be able to utilize that water? And it's important to note that all these should be calibrated to your place. So a T6 zone in Portland, Maine is very different from a T6 zone in New York or Tucson or here in Phoenix. And this is the most intense, and usually it's a very, very small segment of your overall downtown or overall area that you're looking at. So T5 is also a very intense district. You again have the vertical mixed use. You have a lot of storefronts. I call this the Main Street. And again, from a green infrastructure standpoint, this is a hard place to grow trees, and it can be a very expensive place to grow trees. So you're going to want to be looking at things like structural soil. You're going to be having tons of utility conflicts in these areas. There's competition for space. And there really is a science that I've learned with storefronts. And so you have to be very careful about how you design these. And I was in Portland a few years back, and we went to a T5 development, and they put this huge green infrastructure piece in front of their storefront, and separating their sidewalk from their parking area. It was 3 feet deep. I get off my bike, I don't realize it's that deep, and I fall right into it. And so I think we just have to be thoughtful about the design of these types of interventions in this type of environment, and really think about how do we move the water from here and utilize it somewhere else. So the next zone is T4, and this is really what I would call like a transition zone. So buildings start to pull apart, and this is really where we can start to integrate and think about green infrastructure into the built environment. And so there is mixed use, but it's often horizontal mixed use, and you still have an intensity of building types, but not quite the same level. And again, this is a great place where we can really start to think about how we start to incorporate and use some more of our green infrastructure. So bioswales, micro basins, but again, I think also still thinking about it, how can we use this water and move it somewhere else to grow trees? But this is a great place for street trees, and really you have a lot more space for that. And then T3 is what we would call our suburban zones. And so this is where you start to get the large front yards, you start to get the backyards, side yards, and those types of things. So you really have a lot of space with this, and you have a lot more opportunity to incorporate green infrastructure into this type of development. Now, I think because we are in the middle of a housing crisis, it is important to note that even though this has the look and feel of a single family neighborhood, many of these homes are actually duplexes and triplexes and apartment complexes. So you can have up to 12 units in potentially what looks like a single family home. So it's really quite remarkable, the density or the intensity of use that you can get and still have it look and feel like a single family home. So we start to put it all together, right? And I think this image here pretty clearly spells out kind of how green infrastructure works in it. And you can kind of see as we go from, the natural zones into the most intense zones of T6, the area gets much smaller. So you're not going to have nearly as much of that as you are going to have your, natural zones or your T2, your T2 through T, even T5. And that, the green infrastructure, fades into gray infrastructure. So this is just a pretty basic matrix that we put together to just kind of think about, then we start to get into standards, right? So what is your setback? How do you actually, what are those development standards that you're asking people to follow in these various zones? And so with that, you can then layer in your green infrastructure elements, your tree forms. I think this idea of the minimum soil volume is very important, especially here in Phoenix and in the Southwest. How do we give trees the space that they really need to reach their full genetic potential? And so starting to really think about that and regulate that and require that of developers. And then just also thinking about, what is the form that they take in, what is the rainwater retention that you're looking for. So again, T6, I think we're looking at a lot more gray solutions, or we're looking at engineered solutions, and we're really looking at, how do we move that water into other areas that we can utilize it. I also think it's really important, especially when we're asking developers to invest in our urban forests, that we focus on quality over quantity. I think a lot of our standards today are just like, so many trees per, X feet in, a little tiny space, and then they never really end up growing. And I know trees provide a multitude of benefits, and I would love to see them everywhere. But the reality of it is, by trying to get them everywhere, we end up with a lot of really unhealthy trees that don't really ever seem like they're growing. And this is especially true in our urban environment. This is a picture on the left downtown Phoenix. And I think, it starts to beg the question, are we asking people to plant liabilities, or are we growing assets? And can we ask our private sector partners to really make the investment in growing assets and growing those trees that are going to last and really provide the environmental benefits and the economic and the social benefits that big trees really provide? So trying to do compact walkable development is really challenging. And I didn't really fully understand the extent of it until I got out on the other side of it. And there are just so many challenges, from utilities to conflicts in department standards and what is being asked of you. But one of the big challenges that especially small developers are running into is how we regulate stormwater and requiring it at the lot level. And it adds an incredible expense, and it's a big hurdle for a lot of folks to be able to overcome, especially, the smaller developers that are trying to do the high quality, placemaking type of development. So for example, if you're aware of Venue Projects that does just really high quality projects, they did a fourplex in Phoenix, and they were asked to put in over $60,000 in stormwater infrastructure in order to be able to do their project. And so all of those costs then get transferred over to who they are renting or who they are, who's purchasing that property, because ultimately developers have to make a profit, otherwise they're going to go out of business. And so I think we have to be really thoughtful about what it is that we're asking our developers, and recognizing that by asking them to do some of this stuff, we're actually pushing them out of the game, and we're making it easier for the big guys to come in and do development, because they're the ones that have the deep pockets. They can hire, believe it or not, land use attorneys pay their rates are over $1,000 an hour to take you through a rezoning process, or paying professionals like me pretty exorbitant fees to get you through the permitting process. And so I think it's important to kind of recognize, that we're asking for some of these things, but in turn, we're actually creating more hurdles to the type of development and the type of growth that we want. And so I think some things to kind of think about as we move forward with these types of regulations is we need to really think about, how do we bring folks to, more folks to the table. So, there's a lot of people that are involved in green infrastructure and making it work or not work on a project. But then there's all these folks outside of it that really impact it. So everything from, code enforcement to contractors to lawyers, and really just making sure that we're, bringing as many players as we can to the table into these conversations to make sure that standards, that you're not fixing one standard here, but then there's another challenge over here. So for example, in the city of Phoenix, when I was working there, we were asking, everybody, developers and neighbors, to plant trees right on the back of the sidewalk or in between the curb and the sidewalk, if that condition exists. And basically we found out that Public Works had a standard in the city code that basically required all trees to be pruned up to the height of 18 feet. And so here we are asking everybody to make these investments, and then Public Works was coming right behind us after we got it planted, after they got the C of O, and basically just asking them to remove all the branches on, the street side of the street. And so here we are, causing structural issues for the trees and challenges, and really undermining the ability for us to get shade, and potentially impacting the health and well-being of those trees. And so I think it's important, as we look at these standards and as we look at these regulations and as we ask developers to do these things, that we're working through all of our codes and all of our standards, so that we're not creating situations where one department is telling you one thing and then another department is telling you another. And I've been in that situation recently where transit was telling me one thing and streets was telling me another thing, and they were in complete conflict with each other. And just having to navigate that, can take anywhere from a month to 6 weeks, and all of that adds cost and expense to the development project. And I think, in saying all that is I think we have to look beyond our zoning codes and really dig into a lot of those technical standards, So if we're asking, folks to plant trees, between the sidewalk and, their property or from their building, oftentimes, the water department is saying that that's a public utility easement. And so we're ending up putting utilities in those spaces, which means that we can't plant our trees there. And so we really have to look at, how are we designing our utilities under our street, and really thinking about designing those as much as we're designing on what's on top of it. Because it's amazing how many cool and amazing projects, that picture that I started out with, it turns out we couldn't plant any of these trees because there was a water line there and there were utilities there and we had separation requirements, and it didn't matter if we put a root barrier because the standard in this manual said this, and so therefore we had to do it that way. And so I think we really have to look at this as a group and not just stay in our little bubbles. And planners, I mean, we can be some of the most egregious with doing exactly that. But I think it's important that we bring everybody together and we start to figure out these solutions, because otherwise we're not going to be able to do this high quality of development. And, I think John Muir says it pretty well, is like, we really have to think about these in systems and how interconnected all of it is. And so much of this overregulation is really contributing to the challenges that we're having with being able to supply housing. And, I ended up in my last little bit at the city of Phoenix and working in issues with homelessness and in neighborhoods. And it was amazing how many trees I was actually having to remove because neighbors were upset about, people camping under them or pruning them up. And so I think, oftentimes we have really good intentions with the standards and with the work that we're doing, but they can have a lot of unintended consequences. And so we need to be really thoughtful in how we develop our regulations. And it's been interesting because I was part of the team that wrote the form-based code, and now I'm on the other side bringing projects through it. And I'm like, oh man, like, what were we thinking? Like, what, and I knew it, and there was a really good intention with why we did it. But now when we're actually trying to get a really high quality project through, it's really quite, it can be quite challenging. So I'm just going to leave you with, regulation alone won't grow and maintain a thriving urban forest, that we really have to look at education, values, partnership. And I do want to commend everybody that worked on the LID manual here in Phoenix. That is incredible. And we're utilizing it right now in one of my projects to be able to do green infrastructure. And I thank you for all the brain damage that you have saved me. So thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.